Stephanie Reed's manicured nails tapped against her champagne flute as she watched the shabby man fumble with his boarding pass at seat 12A. His daughter clutched a worn stuffed rabbit. His jacket hung loose on tired shoulders. Wrong class. Wrong people. How did charity cases end up in first class? She hissed to the flight attendant, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. The man's calloused fingers paused mid-air. Something metallic glinted from his jacket pocket before he quickly shoved it deeper. His little girl tugged his sleeve, whispering something that made his weathered face soften. The Boeing 777 climbed steadily into storm clouds brewing over Kansas. Stephanie settled back into her leather seat, satisfied with her superiority. But that small badge hidden in the man's pocket was about to change everything. Ryan Carter adjusted Brooklyn's seatbelt for the third time, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he smoothed down her unruly hair. The 7-year-old clutched her stuffed rabbit closer, its missing ear a testament to countless nights of comfort during thunderstorms and nightmares about angels and empty beds. The airplane cabin smelled of recycled air and expensive perfume, a mixture that reminded Ryan of everything wrong with this picture. They didn't belong in first class, but the airline had inexplicably upgraded them after some computer glitch with their economy seats. He'd tried to refuse, but Brooklyn had clapped her hands with delight at the big leather chairs and the kind flight attendant who'd offered her chocolate milk. "Daddy, look how high we are!" Brooklyn whispered, pressing her nose against the small window. Her breath fogged the plexiglass as she traced invisible shapes with her finger. Ryan leaned over to see the patchwork of Kansas farmland spreading below them like a quilted blanket. Sarah would have loved this view. She'd always talked about seeing the world from above, about understanding how small their problems were when measured against the vastness of sky and earth. Now she was somewhere even higher, watching over them both. At least, that's what Ryan told Brooklyn when the nightmares came. That's what he told himself when the loneliness threatened to drown him. The flight attendant approached with practiced politeness, her smile strained and apologetic. She glanced nervously toward Stephanie Reed's expectant face before clearing her throat. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify your boarding passes one more time." Her voice carried the weight of someone being forced into an uncomfortable situation. Ryan reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the small metal object he'd forgotten was there. The badge felt cold against his skin, a reminder of the life he'd abandoned 3 years ago, when Sarah's cancer had taken everything that mattered except the small girl sitting beside him. These tickets were issued by the airline's computer system, Ryan said quietly, handing over the boarding passes. His voice carried no anger, just the weary resignation of someone accustomed to being questioned, doubted, found lacking. "We didn't ask for the upgrade." "We were originally in 23F. Brooklyn looked up from her coloring book, confusion clouding her innocent features. She was too young to understand the subtle cruelties of class distinction, too pure to recognize the judgment in the flight attendant's hesitant movements. Ryan envied her that innocence, even as he dreaded the day she'd lose it. The flight attendant studied their tickets with unnecessary scrutiny, her eyes darting between the paper and their worn clothing. Other first-class passengers watched the drama unfold with varying degrees of interest and disdain. "These appear to be legitimate," she said finally, her disappointment obvious in the slight downturn of her mouth. She retreated toward the galley, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence that settled over their section of the cabin like morning fog. Brooklyn returned to her coloring book, unaware of the tension surrounding her. The pages were filled with her artwork from the past few months, crayon drawings of airplanes flying through rainbow skies toward a golden-haired woman who waved from fluffy white clouds. Sometimes the planes were pink, sometimes purple, but always they carried two small figures, a tall man and a little girl, heading somewhere that looked suspiciously like heaven. "Do you think Mommy can see us from up here?" Brooklyn whispered, not looking up from her latest creation. Ryan's throat tightened around words that wouldn't come. Sarah had always been the one with easy answers, with bedtime stories that made sense of the senseless. She'd told Brooklyn that heaven was just above the clouds, close enough for angels to keep watch over the people they loved, close enough to matter, far enough to break hearts. "She sees everything, sweetheart." He managed finally. "Every smile, every drawing, every time you're brave." His voice cracked on the last word, but Brooklyn didn't notice. She was adding purple wings to her latest angel, humming a lullaby Sarah used to sing. Across the narrow aisle, Stephanie Reed ended another phone call with sharp efficiency. Her third since takeoff, each one more caustic than the last. Market projections, acquisition targets, quarterly reports that would determine the fate of thousands of employees she'd never met and didn't care to. She built her empire on the simple principle that sentiment was weakness and weakness was death in the corporate world. Her phone buzzed again. Another crisis requiring her immediate attention. She answered without preamble. "This is Reed." "Make it quick." The conversation was typical corporate warfare. Hostile takeovers, stock manipulations, the casual destruction of smaller companies that dared to compete in her market space. Ryan tried not to listen, but her voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to getting her way through intimidation and barely contained cruelty. Brooklyn's crayon slipped as the plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, sending her purple marker rolling across the narrow aisle toward Stephanie's designer shoes. The little girl scrambled to retrieve it, her small frame awkward in the cramped space between their seats. Sorry, Brooklyn whispered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she reached for the escaped crayon. Her fingers barely brushed the purple marker before Stephanie's heel came down, dangerously close to her small hand. The CEO looked down with the expression of someone who'd discovered something unpleasant stuck to her shoe. For a moment, Brooklyn froze like a small animal caught in predator's territory. Her wide eyes searched Stephanie's face for some hint of kindness, some sign that the scary lady with the sharp voice might have a soft heart underneath. "Watch where you're going," Stephanie said coldly, her voice sharp enough to make other passengers look up from their magazines and laptops. Some of us paid premium prices to avoid exactly this sort of disruption. She gestured vaguely at Brooklyn's scuffed sneakers and mended jeans, her meaning crystal clear. The child retreated to her seat like a wounded sparrow, tears threatening to spill from eyes too young to understand such casual cruelty. The purple crayon lay forgotten on the cabin floor, abandoned in the no-man's land between their worlds. Ryan felt something dark and dangerous rise in his chest, his hand stilled on the safety card he'd been pretending to read, every muscle in his body going rigid with controlled fury. The same ice-cold rage that had made him legendary in naval aviation, the kind of focused anger that could turn good men into deadly weapons when the situation demanded it. But Brooklyn was watching him with those impossibly wide eyes, trusting him to handle this the way Sarah would have wanted, with dignity, with grace, with the kind of strength that built character instead of destroying it. "It's okay, baby girl." he said softly, reaching over to squeeze Brooklyn's trembling hand. His voice carried no hint of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Some people forgot how to be kind. That doesn't mean we have to forget too. Brooklyn nodded solemnly, but her bottom lip still quivered with the effort of not crying. Ryan's jaw muscle twitched once, the only outward sign of the war between his protective instincts and his better angels. Sarah's voice whispered in his memory, reminding him that how they responded to cruelty would shape his daughter's understanding of the world. The businessman in seat 14B shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus on his laptop, while stealing glances at the unfolding drama. His own children were safe at home with their nanny, probably coloring pictures or playing games that didn't involve navigating adult cruelty at 37,000 feet. The elderly woman by the window tisked quietly under her breath, her disapproval obvious in the tight line of her mouth. Even she remembered what it felt like to be young and vulnerable in a world that seemed determined to prove its harshness. The flight attendant paused in her pre-flight routine, sensing the change in atmosphere like an animal sensing an approaching storm. Brooklyn pulled out a fresh piece of paper and began drawing again. This time her artwork showed a different scene. 2 airplanes flying side by side through a cloudy sky. One was big and shiny and silver, filled with frowning stick figures who looked angry and sad. The other was smaller, rainbow-colored, carrying 2 smiling figures toward a golden sun. At the bottom of the page, in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, she wrote, "Nice people are more beautiful." She held it up for Ryan to see, her earlier tears replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who understood something important about the world. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, professional and reassuring in the way that only comes from decades of experience. "Ladies and gentlemen, from the flight deck, this is your captain speaking. We're currently climbing through 28,000 feet on our way to our cruising altitude of 37,000. We're expecting a smooth ride to Denver today, with an on-time arrival of 3:45 Mountain Time. Flight attendants, you're free to begin cabin service." But Ryan's trained ear caught something others missed, a slight hesitation before smooth. The barely perceptible stress on expecting, subtle warning signs that spoke of challenges ahead. The turbulence started as whispers in the airframe, gentle bumps that most passengers dismissed as routine flight conditions, the kind of minor disturbances that occur when metal birds push through 37,000 feet of atmosphere. But Ryan felt the subtle changes in engine harmonics, the slight variations in wing loading that spoke of weather systems building ahead. His fingers unconsciously tightened on the armrest as he counted the intervals between each bump. 15 seconds. 12. 8. The pattern was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong to someone who'd spent years learning to read the language of aircraft in distress. Brooklyn continued working on her drawings, creating an entire fleet of rainbow airplanes filled with happy families flying toward destinations that looked suspiciously like cloud-covered playgrounds. Her tongue stuck out slightly as she concentrated on getting the details right. The purple wings, the golden halos, the way the sun smiled down at everyone equally, regardless of the price of their tickets or the quality of their clothes. Ryan watched her work and felt something loosen in his chest. This was why he'd walked away from naval aviation. This innocence, this purity of vision that saw the world as it should be rather than as it was. A coffee cup rattled against its saucer in the galley, the sound barely audible above the constant white noise of pressurized flight. But Ryan heard it. felt it in the subtle vibrations that traveled through the aircraft's frame like messages in a language only pilots understood. The senior flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and steady hands, caught his attention with a brief glance. She felt it too, the sense that something was building beyond the normal parameters of routine flight, something that would soon demand more than practiced smiles and beverage service. Stephanie Reed tried to ignore the growing unease in the cabin, focusing instead on the spreadsheet displayed on her tablet screen. Profit margins, market projections, the cold mathematics of corporate dominance that had lifted her from poverty to power through sheer force of will and ruthless determination. But something about the man across the aisle kept drawing her attention. The way his eyes tracked every sound, every vibration, every subtle change in the aircraft's behavior, like a predator maintaining constant awareness of his environment, or a guardian standing eternal watch over something precious and vulnerable. The first real jolt came without warning, sudden and sharp and violent enough to rattle the overhead compartments and send Brooklyn's crayons skittering across the floor in a rainbow cascade of abandoned artwork. Passengers gasped and grabbed their armrests, that universal airplane reaction that preceded either nervous laughter or genuine panic. The captain's voice returned immediately, still controlled but carrying a new edge of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some unexpected weather ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts while we navigate around these storm cells." But Ryan could hear what wasn't being said. The micropause before weather, the slight uptick in vocal stress that spoke of problems more serious than atmospheric disturbance. His military training kicked in automatically, assessing escape routes, counting passengers, calculating the odds of various emergency scenarios. Brooklyn grabbed his arm with both small hands, her artwork forgotten in the face of something she didn't understand but instinctively feared. "Daddy, what's happening?" Her voice was smaller now, uncertain in a way that made Ryan's protective instincts flare like solar storms. Emergency lighting flickered on briefly, just long enough for Ryan to automatically map every exit, count every row, measure every angle between their seats and potential escape routes. The businessman in 14B had gone pale, his laptop screen reflecting the fear in his wide eyes. The elderly woman clutched her purse like a lifeline, photographs of grandchildren scattered across her tray table like prayers made visible. Even Stephanie Reed had stopped pretending to work, her tablet forgotten, as she gripped the leather armrests hard enough to leave permanent impressions. Brooklyn's stuffed rabbit fell to the floor as the aircraft lurched again, this time with a sickening sideways motion that spoke of control surfaces fighting atmospheric forces beyond the normal range of commercial aviation. Other passengers were beginning to panic now, that low-level fear that spreads through confined spaces like contagion. The flight attendants moved with careful, deliberate precision toward their emergency stations, their professional masks slipping just enough to reveal the growing concern underneath. They knew something the passengers didn't, something that made experienced crew members check and recheck their emergency procedures. Then came the sound that changed everything. A mechanical groan from deep within the aircraft's belly, metal under stress in ways that Boeing engineers had tested but hoped would never occur in actual flight operations. The kind of sound that meant critical components were failing in cascading sequences that couldn't be stopped with routine procedures or pilot skill alone. Ryan's blood turned to ice water. He'd heard that sound before, in combat situations where staying airborne meant the difference between medals and memorial services. Brooklyn whimpered against his chest, her small body trembling with each new vibration that shook the aircraft's frame like a child's toy in an earthquake. The oxygen masks dropped like yellow flowers blooming in hellish slow motion. That universal signal that meant the illusion of routine flight was over, replaced by the harsh reality of emergency procedures and survival protocols. Brooklyn stared at her mask with eyes wide enough to hold the entire sky, her small hands shaking as she reached for the plastic cup that would keep her breathing in the thin air of high altitude. "What's happening, Daddy?" Why are the masks down? But Ryan was already moving, his hands steady despite the chaos around them, securing her oxygen supply before his own in accordance with both safety procedures and paternal instinct. Passengers were screaming now, that raw sound of people confronting their own mortality without preparation or grace. Cell phones emerged like desperate talismans, fingers frantically trying to connect with loved ones one last time before the unthinkable became inevitable. The cabin pressure was dropping steadily, which meant hull integrity was compromised somewhere in the aircraft's structure, which meant they had minutes, not hours, to find solutions to problems that might not have solutions at all. The mathematics of disaster were elegant in their simplicity. Time, altitude, and hope decreasing in direct proportion to each other. The captain's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk, but this time the professional calm was gone entirely. Raw fear bled through every carefully chosen word, the sound of a man who'd run out of routine procedures and was now operating in the realm of prayer and desperate improvisation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have experienced dual engine failure and are declaring an emergency. Flight attendants, initiate emergency procedures immediately." A pause filled with the sound of 180 people holding their breath. Then the words that made Ryan's heart stop completely. "If there are any licensed pilots on board this aircraft, please identify yourselves immediately. We need your assistance in the cockpit." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that exists only in the moment before everything changes forever. 180 people waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up and claim the knowledge that might save them all. Ryan felt Brooklyn's eyes on him through her oxygen mask, those impossibly trusting eyes that believed Daddy could fix anything, solve any problem, chase away any nightmare that dared to threaten their small family. Stephanie Reed was staring at him now, her earlier contempt replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. The way he'd catalogued emergency exits, the way his body had gone still instead of panicking when the crisis began. The small metallic object she'd glimpsed falling from his jacket pocket during boarding. "You know about airplanes," she said, her voice muffled by the oxygen mask but carrying a desperate certainty. "I can see it in your face, in the way you're sitting. Please." The word came out broken and raw, nothing like the commanding tone she'd used to dismiss him as charity trash. Other passengers were looking at him too now. The businessman clutching his phone like a lifeline. The elderly woman with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Perfect strangers who'd ignored his existence during the boarding process, but now studied him with the desperate intensity of drowning people searching for rescue. Ryan closed his eyes and saw Sarah's face as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. Her voice from the hospital bed, weak but determined. "Promise me you'll take care of our girl, Ryan. Promise me you'll keep her safe no matter what it costs you." He'd retired from naval aviation the next week, walking away from everything he'd trained for to become the father Brooklyn needed. But keeping Brooklyn safe meant more than just avoiding dangerous situations. Sometimes it meant running toward them with everything you had, betting your life and your daughter's future on skills you'd spent years praying you'd never need to use again. Ryan stood up slowly, the movement controlled and deliberate despite the aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior. Every eye in the cabin tracked him as he reached into his jacket and withdrew the small metal object he'd been hiding. The naval aviator badge caught the emergency lighting, its gold surface reflecting fragments of hope across desperate faces. "Lieutenant Commander Ryan Carter," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who'd faced death before and lived to tell about it. "United States Navy Top Gun graduate, 4,000 flight hours in military and civilian aircraft." The silence was complete now, even the screaming engines seeming to quiet in recognition of someone who spoke their language. "I need to get to the cockpit immediately." The words carried no doubt, no hesitation, just the calm certainty of a professional accepting responsibility for an impossible situation. Brooklyn reached for him as he stepped into the aisle, her small hand catching his sleeve with desperate strength. "Daddy, don't leave me." "I'm scared." Her voice was muffled by the oxygen mask, but the terror was crystal clear in eyes that had already lost too much. Ryan knelt beside her seat, bringing his face level with hers so she could see the love and determination in his expression. "Remember what Mommy always told you about angels, baby girl?" Brooklyn nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She said they watch over people who can't protect themselves. Sometimes we have to be angels for other people, even when we're scared." The senior flight attendant was already moving towards them, her professional training overriding personal fear in the face of potential salvation. "Sir, if you're really a pilot, we need you in the cockpit now. The situation is—" She gestured helplessly at the chaos around them, words inadequate to describe the magnitude of their crisis. Ryan kissed Brooklyn's forehead through her oxygen mask, tasting salt tears and the metallic flavor of recycled air. "I'll be right back, sweetheart." "I promise. Daddy's going to fix this and bring everyone home safe." The words carried absolute conviction, as if saying them with enough certainty could make them true. The walk to the cockpit felt like crossing a battlefield under enemy fire. Every step took him further from the quiet, safe life he'd built, and closer to the world he'd tried to leave behind. The world where split-second decisions determined whether people lived or died, where the margin for error was measured in degrees and seconds and heartbeats. Passengers reached out as he passed, touching his arm like he was some kind of talisman against disaster. The businessman pressed a photo into his hand. "My kids," he whispered. "Please." The elderly woman made the sign of the cross. Even Stephanie Reed nodded at him, her face streaked with tears she probably didn't remember shedding. The cockpit door stood open like the mouth of some technological beast, alarms blaring from every direction in a symphony of electronic panic. Warning lights painted the instrument panel in angry reds and yellows, each one representing a system failure that should have been impossible in normal flight operations. The captain, a silver-haired man with 20-year eyes, looked up as Ryan entered. His hands never stopped moving across the controls, fighting to maintain some semblance of control over an aircraft that seemed determined to fall from the sky. "Thank God you're here," Captain Morrison breathed, relief and desperation warring in his voice. "I'm Captain Morrison. This is First Officer Hayes. We've lost both engines to what appears to be catastrophic mechanical failure. Hydraulic systems are compromised, electrical systems running on emergency power only. We're basically flying a very heavy glider at this point." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "I've got 30 years of experience, Commander. but I've never seen anything like this. We need a miracle worker. Ryan slid into the jump seat behind the pilots, his trained eyes immediately scanning the instrument displays with the systematic precision of someone who'd learned to read aircraft systems like other people read books. The numbers were bad. Altitude bleeding away too fast. Airspeed dropping toward stall territory. Control surfaces responding sluggishly to pilot input. But not impossible. Not yet. The aircraft was wounded, maybe dying, but still flying. Still responsive to someone who knew how to ask nicely instead of demanding compliance. What's our position relative to suitable airports? Ryan asked, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. His mind was already calculating glide ratios, wind patterns, descent angles, the cold mathematics of survival that reduced human lives to engineering problems with definable solutions. Captain Morrison rattled off coordinates and distances, while First Officer Hayes continued fighting the increasingly unresponsive controls. Topeka Regional is our best option, Morrison said. 18 miles northeast. We might make it if we can maintain control and optimize our glide path. Define might, Ryan said, his hands already reaching for secondary controls. The aircraft bucked like an angry horse as another system failed, but he rode the motion instead of fighting it. In current configuration, with no engine power and degraded control authority, I'd estimate our chances at maybe 30%. Morrison's honesty was brutal but necessary. They were beyond the point where optimistic lies would help anyone. The approach is going to be fast and steep. One chance only. No power available for a go-around if we miss the first attempt. Ryan nodded grimly, accepting the parameters of their impossible situation. Tell air traffic control we're declaring emergency priority. Clear all traffic from Topeka Regional and get emergency services standing by. Full crash and rescue response. He paused, studying the instrument panel with the focused intensity of someone solving a life-and-death puzzle. And tell the cabin crew to prepare passengers for emergency landing procedures. This is going to be rough. His voice carried no doubt, no hesitation. Just the calm acceptance of someone who'd done impossible things before and was prepared to do them again. Give me the controls, Ryan said. It wasn't a request. Captain Morrison hesitated for exactly one heartbeat, then moved aside with the grace of someone recognizing superior expertise in a crisis situation. Ryan's hands found the yoke, and immediately he felt the aircraft's distress like touching a wounded animal. The Boeing wanted to fall, wanted to surrender to gravity and physics and the inevitable conclusion of metal meeting Earth at terminal velocity. But Ryan had spent years learning to coax performance from broken machines, to find lift where none should exist, to make the impossible seem routine. His touch was different from Morrison's, gentler but more confident, like a surgeon's hands on a patient's heart or a musician's fingers on beloved strings. The aircraft responded immediately, its erratic behavior settling into something resembling controlled flight. Not normal, not safe, but manageable by someone who understood that flying was less about fighting the sky than about becoming part of it. "There we go," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the alarm symphony. "Easy, girl. Let's bring everyone home." Back in the cabin, Brooklyn pressed her face against the window, watching the ground rise to meet them at speeds that seemed too fast, too steep, too final. Other passengers had followed the flight attendant's instructions, assuming crash positions that made them look like they were praying to the god of metal and combustion. The businessman was recording what he thought might be his final message to his family. The elderly woman clutched photographs of grandchildren she might never see grow up. Stephanie Reed found herself bargaining with a deity she hadn't acknowledged since childhood, promising charitable donations and reformed behavior in exchange for one more chance to get things right. "Emergency services report ready at Topeka Regional," came the radio call that cut through their focused concentration like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors. "Runway 18 cleared and ready. Wind 080 at 12 knots. Emergency vehicles in position." Ryan acknowledged the transmission with professional brevity, but his attention remained focused on the impossible mathematics of their approach. Too high, too fast. Too many variables that could turn their controlled emergency into unsurvivable catastrophe. But slowly, impossibly, the numbers began aligning. Airspeed decreasing toward acceptable parameters. Descent rate manageable. Touchdown zone achievable. "You're doing it," Captain Morrison whispered, awe replacing fear in his voice. "You're actually bringing us home." The runway appeared ahead of them, like a ribbon of hope stretched across the Kansas landscape. Too short, too narrow, but the only chance they had. Ryan's hands worked the controls with surgical precision, fighting crosswinds and failing systems to keep their wounded bird aligned with salvation. Every second balanced on the knife edge between controlled flight and catastrophic failure. Every heartbeat a negotiation between physics and hope. The final approach stretched like eternity compressed into minutes. Ryan could feel the aircraft's pain in his bones, could sense its desperate desire to stay airborne despite mechanical systems that should have made flight impossible. Behind him, he could hear Morrison praying in languages he probably didn't remember learning. Hayes was calling out airspeed and altitude like a mantra against disaster. And through the cockpit door, Ryan could hear the sound of 180 people holding their breath, trusting him to deliver them safely to the ground. The landing was controlled violence, wheels touching pavement at speeds that tested every bolt, every rivet, every prayer that had been offered in the past terrible hour. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled onto the runway with the grace of a wounded bird, finally finding safe harbor. Sparks flew from overheated brakes as they fought to stop their forward momentum. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, foam spraying across superheated metal as the Boeing finally, impossibly, rolled to a complete stop. For a moment, silence. Then slowly, the sound of 180 people remembering how to breathe. They were alive. All of them. Against every odd, every calculation, every reasonable expectation based on the magnitude of their mechanical failures. The evacuation was swift and professional. Emergency slides deploying like giant yellow tongues to carry passengers away from potential fire or explosion. But there was no fire, no explosion, just the quiet miracle of survival in a world that had briefly forgotten how to make sense. Brooklyn was among the first passengers Ryan saw after emerging from the cockpit, a small body launching into his arms with the force of pure relief and desperate love. "Daddy, you came back. You saved everyone." Her words were muffled against his chest, but the joy in her voice was audible across the tarmac, where emergency workers continued their systematic response to a disaster that had somehow become a rescue. Ryan held her tight, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, breathing in the impossible sweetness of her continued existence. Around them, passengers were crying, laughing, calling loved ones to report the impossible news. They were alive. They were all alive, and that was the only statistic that would matter for the rest of their lives. Stephanie Reed approached slowly, her earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like humility. Her designer outfit was wrinkled and stained with tears she didn't remember shedding. Her carefully styled hair hung limp around a face that had aged years in the space of hours. "Commander Carter," she said formally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my life. We all do." She gestured at the other survivors being checked by paramedics, their faces reflecting the same stunned gratitude. "I was wrong about you. About your daughter. About everything that actually matters." Ryan studied her face, seeing past the expensive facade to something rawer and more honest underneath. Fear stripped away pretense like acid, revealing whatever lay beneath the carefully constructed surfaces people showed the world. "We all make assumptions, Ms. Reed. I assumed you were just another entitled executive who'd never faced real consequences for your actions. Maybe we both learned something important today." He shifted Brooklyn to his hip, her arm still wrapped around his neck like she might never let go. "The question is what we do with that knowledge moving forward." Stephanie nodded, understanding passing between them like electricity across water. "I'd like to start by offering you a position with Reed Industries, Chief of Aviation Safety. Design your own salary, your own terms, your own team. Help me build something better than what I've been." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Ryan looked around at the faces of people who were breathing because he'd chosen to step forward instead of staying hidden. Brooklyn whispered something in his ear that made him smile for the first time in hours. "What do you think, baby girl? Should Daddy go back to flying planes?" Brooklyn nodded solemnly, her expression serious beyond her years. "Mommy would want you to save people, Daddy. Like angels do." Ryan felt something shift inside his chest, a door opening that he'd kept locked since Sarah's funeral. The possibility that hiding from his past wasn't the same as protecting his future. That some promises were best kept by embracing the very things you'd tried to leave behind. 6 months later, Ryan Carter stood in the cockpit of Reed Industries' newest corporate aircraft, his naval aviator badge gleaming against a crisp new uniform. The instrument panel was state-of-the-art, incorporating every safety innovation his team had developed since joining the company. Brooklyn sat in the passenger cabin, her latest artwork taped to the bulkhead where everyone could see it. The drawing showed 3 figures standing beside a sleek airplane, a tall man in pilot's uniform, a small girl with rainbow wings, and a golden-haired woman whose smile seemed to bless their journey. "Daddy!" Brooklyn called from her seat, holding up her newest creation. "I drew us with Mommy watching from heaven." "She looks happy, doesn't she?" Ryan felt the familiar tightness in his throat, but this time it was mixed with something else. Something that felt like healing, like hope, like the understanding that keeping promises and taking risks weren't mutually exclusive after all. Sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to embrace life completely, including the parts that scared you most. Stephanie Reed worked quietly at her laptop across the aisle, her entire corporate philosophy transformed by 30 minutes of terror at 37,000 feet. The Reed Foundation had become one of the largest charitable organizations in the country, funding everything from aviation safety research to single-parent support programs. She looked up as Ryan began his pre-flight announcement, and for just a moment she saw not the man who'd saved her life, but the father who'd risked everything for the chance to keep his daughter safe. The intercom crackled to life, Ryan's voice filling the cabin with the same calm authority that had guided them safely home on that terrible day over Kansas. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Carter with your pre-flight briefing. We're looking at clear skies and smooth air all the way to Denver today. Our flight time will be approximately 2 hours, with an on-time arrival at Denver International. Thank you for choosing Reed Industries, where we believe the most important cargo we carry isn't goods or contracts, but the precious lives entrusted to our care. Through the cockpit window, the Rocky Mountains rose like promises against the Colorado sky. And somewhere above the clouds, in that space between earth and heaven where angels keep their watch, Sarah Carter smiled down at her family's newest adventure. They were flying again. All of them, together.